In this video, I'll be discussing process costing. Companies which use process costing will be companies which produce one sort of homogeneous product, so they just mass produce. These type of companies contrast with those companies that produce many different types of products, and they produce they don't necessarily mass produce. They make different orders for different people. So one person might want an order of 1,000 of one type of product of theirs, and another person might want an order of 2,000 of a different type of product. And that's sort of in a setting, it's easier to track costs by job. So once you've completed the job, you can add up all the costs of the job and divide it by the number of units of that job produced to get the per unit cost. So companies which are set up like that, they produce many different products for different people, so different jobs, so to speak. They would use job order costing. But companies which mass produce one product, and they just produce it a bunch, and then they sell it to some distributor, and the distributor sells it to the wholesaler, and then the wholesaler sells it to you. These type of companies, say for example a cereal manufacturer, or say for example a Coca-Cola, a bottling company, they just mass produce Coke. Process costing becomes the method of choice for them in determining their work in process costs. And the reason is, at the end of any given period, say at the end of a month, there are going to be many units of the product that are partially done. And so how do you figure out the cost of a partially done unit? It seems kind of tricky to do that, right? If you have a one unit done, then you can calculate the cost for one unit, right? And divide it by that one unit, and you can get the per unit cost. Or if you have 5 units done, you can figure out the total cost and divide by 5 to get the per unit cost. But if you have a bunch of units that are partially done, and some of the units are are more done than other units, so they're not all equally done, then it becomes very difficult to figure out what the cost should be assigned to those particular units, because they're not done yet. And process costing is a way to estimate the costs of partially completed units. If you remember from lecture, the core concept behind process costing is this idea of equivalent units. The idea that 2 units that are each, say, half done, each 50% done, that's equivalent to 1 unit being 100% done. And we've said, obviously, that that's an assumption that's doesn't really hold, right? Neither one of those units are 100% done. So how can you add two of them together that are each half done and you get a completed unit, one that's completely done? Well, you can't, right? They're still both half done. But in determining costs, you have to assume something. And this seems like a reasonable assumption. And if you make that assumption, then we'll see how far it can take us. Now, here's an example where a company, they manufacture a single product and they use process costing. This product goes through 2 processing departments. So we have the etching department and the wiring department. And they give us some data regarding what happened in the etching department during July. So this company has 2 work in process accounts. They have a work in process etching account. In this T account, they will track all the costs related to the units that pass through this department, this work in process department. So the cost for labor, cost for materials, cost for overhead. Now, when we talk about, when we're going to be doing these examples, we're going to let the cost for materials just be labeled as materials, and then the cost for labor and overhead, we're going to label that as conversion costs. So conversion costs are those costs that are incurred for labor and overhead, manufacturing overhead, and materials cost would be those costs that are incurred for materials, direct materials. So the company has a work in process etching account, and they also have a work in process wiring account, T account, corresponding to that department. Once the stuff gets through the etching department, once it's completely done with respect to the etching department, the units aren't completely done yet, right? They're transferred to the wiring department. And then the costs from this department, all whatever's here at the end, is transferred over to the wiring. The cost related to those units that were transferred gets transferred over to the wiring in the form of a journal entry, which I think we talked about in lecture. But the entry obviously would be, you would take those costs and put them into wiring, and you would take them out of etching. So there's some overview of what's going on here at this company, and I think you have an idea already what the journal entries would be for process costing. It's just like for job costing. It's the same set of journal entries. So you can go back to the previous video that I posted about job costing. The only difference is this journal entry right here. There might be more than one work in process account because it's process costing. There are different processing departments, and if there is more than one, you're going to have to transfer the cost from one of the processing departments to the other one. So that would be the only difference in journal entries. So anyway, this company makes one product, they use process costing, and let's see, so we have some information here. It says that materials are added at several stages during the etching process. So we have production data up here, and then we have cost data down here. So there's 60,000 units in beginning work in process inventory. These units are 60% complete with respect to materials costs, and they are 30% complete with respect to conversion costs. They start 510,000 units into production this month. And at the end of July, there are 70,000 units. Each of these units is 80% complete with respect to materials and 40% complete with respect to conversion. They give us some information regarding this WIP account. So the beginning balance in WIP, it looks like it's 40,000 right here. And then there were costs added. I'm sorry, there's 40,000 in there. And then the cost added would be the sum of these two numbers. There was 468,000 added for materials, and then there were 357,000 added for labor. So that's what this information right here is telling us. And the whole purpose of this exercise is to figure out, if we think about a cup, we know the costs that were there at the beginning, and we know the costs that are added. Right? There's the beginning costs right here. And here are the costs that were added right here. And the question is, at the end of the period, at the end of July, supposedly we got some stuff done, right? Some units were completed and they were sent to the wiring department, to the next processing department. And obviously, once those units are gone from the etching department, the costs related to getting those units gone also has to leave. So we've poured some cost out, transfer that over to the wiring department. And that once we pour some out, there's some ending costs left in here. And I've not drawn this scale. There could be more left at the end than there was at the beginning, or there could be less left at the end than there was at the beginning. I've drawn it to where there's less left at the end, but it doesn't have to be like that. So the whole purpose of this exercise is to figure out an estimate of the dollar amount of cost that went out. And then once we have an estimate of that, we can automatically get the dollar amount of costs that are left, right? Just use the formula that beginning plus added minus what went out equals ending. Or inversely, we could figure out we can estimate the costs that are left. Those units that are left in the work in process etching department, the costs associated with those units to get those units to the point. They're still in the etching department. They haven't left yet because they're not done completely with respect to that department. But the cost incurred to get them to the point where they are at July 31st, we can estimate those. And then once we have that, then we can automatically gives us an estimate for how much went out by using that same formula, right? So this is the idea. So we're going to be estimating this guy, and we're going to be estimating this guy. We're just going to do it under two different approaches, the Fifo method and the weighted average method. So we need to calculate the equivalent units for July for the etching department using both methods. That's the first step. And then the second step is calculate the cost per equivalent unit for July for the etching department using both methods. And then the third step is determine the total cost of ending WIP and the total cost that was transferred out for both methods. In other words, get an estimate for this and this for both methods. And then step 4 is you can prepare a cost reconciliation. To basically you just ensure that your estimates for what went out and what went in and what was left added together under both methods, either method, this should still hold. Whatever went out plus whatever your estimate was for what was left has to be equal to the stuff that we know, the sum of the things that we know, right? Stuff that was we added plus the stuff that was already there. So this has to hold, and that's all the cost reconciliation does right here in part 4. If it doesn't hold, then you made a mistake. So now let's start with number 1 here. Calculate the equivalent units for July using the Fifo method. Now under Fifo, the equivalent units, which we will label as EU, they're equal to the equivalent units in the beginning inventory or maybe I should say this, equivalent beginning units plus the units that were started and completed this period plus the units that are left, the equivalent units that are left. So equivalent end units. We went over this in lecture. Now, so there's some units there that are sitting at the beginning. There's 60,000 with respect to materials. I'm sorry, there are 60,000 units at the beginning, right? But they're not complete. They're not completed yet. They're partially done. We want to get the equivalent units, we want to get the equivalent units that we have left to complete, right? For FIFO. We'll go through that here in just a sec. Now, started and completed. Units started and completed. Sometimes this tends to trip students up, but let's write down a formula so that we can figure out what the units started and completed are. How many units there are at the beginning, plus the units that you start this period, minus the units that you complete and transfer out, has to be equal to the ending units. So hopefully that makes sense. The units there at the beginning plus the units you start minus the units that go out has to be equal to whatever's left. Now, of the units that we completed and transferred this period, some of those units were started in a previous period and they were sitting here already in the beginning, partially done. And then some of these units that we completed and transferred this period were units that we started this period. So units completed and transferred are made up of units that we started and completed this period, plus all the beginning units. That's what units completed and transferred equal. So if that's the case, then the units that are started and completed this period It's that portion of units that we completed, that portion of those that were started this period. Some of the ones we completed were already partially done at the beginning of the period, and we just got them all the way done. And then some of those units that we completed this period, we actually started those this period. So that portion is equal to, you can just, if units started and completed plus units in the beginning are equal to units completed and transferred, then you can rearrange, right? You can get that units started and completed are equal to the units completed and transferred minus the units in the beginning. All right, but the units that were, so there, here's a relationship. But the units completed and transferred, we can just take this formula and solve for the units completed and transferred. It would be the beginning units, right? If we solve this formula that I've underlined for units completed and transferred, it's just the beginning units plus units started minus the ending units. Right? That's what units completed and transferred equals. This equals this, right? And then when we subtract the beginning units from that, you see that beginning units right here cancels with beginning units right here, so that we just have units started minus ending units. And that makes sense. So the units started and completed are equal to the units started minus the ending units. How many ever units we started this period minus what's left, right? Must be the units that we, of the units that we started, the ones that we completed, or of the ones we completed, the ones that we had started this period. Same thing. Obviously, there's an implicit assumption here that the first units we complete, whenever we complete a unit, the first ones we complete are the beginning units. And that's why in the lecture notes I wrote, if you look carefully, that it doesn't matter whether you use FIFO or weighted average. Both methods assume a FIFO inventory flow assumption. The first units there that go in, the ones in the beginning, are the first ones to go out. That's the assumption. If you assume that, then units started and completed equals units started minus ending. So, there's a formula for units started and completed that you can put here. Units started minus ending. And then the equivalent end unit, plus the equivalent end unit. So if we add these three up, we get the equivalent units for FIFO. Now, what about for weighted average? Equivalent units for weighted average is equal to not the equivalent beginning units, but just the beginning units, plus units started and completed, plus equivalent ending units. So another way to say this is that the equivalent units for weighted average is equal to the units completed and transferred plus the equivalent ending units. That's the same thing as, because units completed and transferred is the same thing as beginning units plus the units started and completed. Right here. You wrote this earlier. So, but to be consistent and make it look as similar to FIFO as possible, I'm going to write it like this. Now, under weighted average, the only difference between weighted average and FIFO, well, there are several differences, but they are all the differences arise from this one main difference, which is all that it's the assumption. Weighted average assumes that the units there at the beginning are 0% done, despite the fact that they're not, and we know they're not. So, but FIFO just takes the units for the percentage completion that they are done, and just tries to calculate how many more units, in an equivalent sense, how many units do we have to take from being 0% done to 100% done. But weighted averages assumes we have to take all the units from 0% done to 100% done, all the beginning units, because it assumes all of them are 0% complete. So that's the only difference between weighted average and FIFO. And that difference causes a difference in the estimation of the different costs that we're trying to estimate. So let's go ahead and calculate the equivalent units for using FIFO for materials, and then the equivalent units using FIFO for conversion. And the same thing, equivalent units using weighted average for materials, and the equivalent units using weighted average for conversion. So these four things. Now, for FIFO, it is the equivalent beginning units, first thing there. So, in terms of materials, what are the equivalent beginning units? And I should have written something different here. It's the equivalent beginning, equivalent units needed to complete beginning. Maybe that's a better way to say it. Equivalent units needed to complete beginning. That's probably the most descriptive way to say it. So we have 60,000 units there at the beginning. If we go back, you'll see that. There's 60,000 units right here sitting here at the beginning. 60,000 units of our product, whatever the product is. And they're each 60% done with respect to materials. So 60,000 units, each 60% done with respect to materials. If you multiply those two together, that means that there are 36,000 units. That's equivalent to 36,000 units, each being 100% done with respect to materials, using our equivalent units assumption. So there's times 0.6. Each of these units is 60% done, so that's equivalent to 36,000 units, each being 100% done, which leaves left over 24,000 units. If 36,000 out of the 60,000 are each 100% done, and 24,000 out of the 60,000 are each 0% done, then we need to take 24,000 units of the 60,000 and take them and complete them. Take them from 0 to 100%. And that's what FIFO assumes. So the equivalent units needed to complete the beginning inventory would be 24,000 units. And you just get that by taking the beginning inventory, multiply it by 1 minus the percentage completion of those units. 1 minus 0.6, or 60,000 times 0.4, and you get the 24,000. Plus units started and completed. Let's use this formula right here. Units started and completed equals units started minus ending. How many units were started? 510,000. How many units are left at the end? 70,000. So units started and completed is 510 minus 70. Plus, and the final thing here is the equivalent ending units. There are 70,000 left at the end, and with respect to materials, they're 80% complete. So that's equivalent to 70,000 units, each 80% done, is equivalent to this many units, each 100% done. 56,000 units. So this is 56,000. This is 640. I'm sorry, 440, and then this is 24,000. So we get an equivalent sense. We get how many units that we completed this period. We completed these 24,000. Took those 24,000 that were each 0% done in beginning inventory. First completed those. Then we started and completed 440,000. And then there's 70,000 left at the end, each 80% done, but that's equivalent to 56,000, each being 100% done. So a portion of those units left at the end are also done, even though we haven't transferred them out yet. So this is the idea behind this equivalent units concept. And this is the FIFO calculation for equivalent units with respect to materials. So you end up getting, where are we going to put this? If you add those up, you get 520,000. What about for conversion? Same idea. 60,000 at the beginning times 1 minus the percentage completion of those units. And with conversion, with respect to conversion, they're 30% complete. So 1 minus 0.3. Plus the units that were started and completed. Plus the equivalent ending units. There's 70,000 left. Each of the units, I believe, is 40% done with respect to conversion. Yeah, right here. So when you add that up, you will get 510,000. Now let's do weighted average. Under weighted average, we just simply have the beginning units. But I'm going to go ahead and multiply this by something. Weighted average assumes that each of these 60,000 is 0% done with respect to, in this case, materials. Even though we know that each of these 60,000 is 60% done, it tells us that. But weighted average just assumes that they're each 0% done, for simplicity's sake, to simplify the calculations. That means that we are taking these 60,000 and making them, we're completing all 60,000 of these units. We're taking all 60,000 from 0 to 100% complete, under weighted average. I could replace this right here with the same thing as I had for FIFO, and it still makes sense. If I really want to make sure that I'm making, what are the equivalent units needed to complete beginning work in process inventory? Well, under the weighted average assumption, where we assume every unit in the beginning inventory is 0% done, then these are the equivalent units needed to complete. It just turns out that those equal the beginning inventory, because we are assuming that each one is 0% done. Hopefully that makes sense. So you can see that this is actually, this first thing right here is just beginning inventory. Plus units started and completed, plus equivalent ending units. So the last two parts are the same as the last two parts for FIFO. It's just the first part is different. And you end up getting 556,000. And then for conversion, we take our 60,000. We assume each unit is 0% done with respect to conversion. We have to complete all 60,000 of those. We know we start and complete these units. And then we know we have equivalent, in an equivalent sense, we have this many units completed, sitting in ending WIP. So for conversion, we have 528,000. Again, notice that let's compare these two guys. For materials, EU using FIFO and EU using weighted average. They're the same calculation, with the exception of this first part here, right? Weighted average assumes each unit is 0% done. FIFO assumes whatever the truth is, that each unit is 60% done. So we only have to take 40% of these units and complete them. Only 40% of these units under FIFO are considered to be 0% done as of the beginning of the year. And under weighted average, all 100% of these units, all 60,000 units, are assumed to be 0% done. Both methods are wrong in their assumption, right? Under FIFO, there aren't 24,000 units that are 0% done. No, all the units are 60% done. But FIFO assumes that 24,000 of them are 0% done. Weighted average assumes that all of them are 0% done. And so you can quickly see then that that there's a relationship. The equivalent units under FIFO, whether it's for materials or conversion, is always less than or equal to the equivalent units under weighted average. And this inequality becomes an equality, in other words, they're equal, whenever the units in the beginning inventory truly are 0% done. Right? Because then we would put a 0 here. If they truly are 0% done. And I guess this implies that the closer beginning inventory is to being 100% done, the bigger the difference between, the bigger this difference, right? Here, each unit is 60% done, and the difference between 556,000 and 520,000 is 36,000. Right? The difference is exactly 60,000 times percentage completion. And so if it was 100% done, then the difference would be as big as it could possibly be, which would be 60,000. So if you want to actually calculate, to get the equivalent units under FIFO, you just take the equivalent units under weighted average and you subtract the beginning inventory times percent completion. Right? Here's a formula that you should know. So once you get one of these, you can get the other one, right? So for example, we can test this out. The equivalent units for materials, it doesn't matter whether it's for materials or for conversion, this formula is still true. The equivalent units for materials for weighted average was 556,000 minus the beginning inventory times the percentage completion. And what do you get? You get 520,000, which was the equivalent units under FIFO for materials. See? Oops. Took the 556, subtract 60,000 times 0.6, and we get 520,000. So this is just straightforward algebra. Alright, so it looks like as a takeaway, weighted average overestimates the number of units that we complete for a given period. Overestimates. And this overestimate is increasing with the percentage completion of those beginning inventory units. It gets bigger and bigger, the more and more of an overestimate. The more complete those beginning units are, the closer the percentage completion is to 100%. Let's go on to 2. The cost per equivalent unit. Well, under FIFO, cost per equivalent unit is equal to the costs that are added to work in process divided by the equivalent units that we So we spread cost in the numerator over units in the denominator. Then for weighted average, cost per equivalent unit is equal to whatever was there at the beginning plus the costs that were added over equivalent units, but calculated using the weighted average method. And you can quickly see that, just based on this, that weighted average blends together. So weighted average blends together costs from previous period with costs of the current period and estimating current period costs. How can we see this? These beginning work in process costs, the costs that are already sitting there as of the beginning of this period, those were costs that were incurred in a previous period to get those units to the extent completion that they are as of the beginning of this period. And so when we're calculating the cost per equivalent unit for this period, why would we be putting something in the numerator that was a cost from a previous period? We kind of just want to put costs from this period over units of this period. And that's what Fifo attempts to do. And that's why we think Fifo is more meaningful. If you want to use the word accurate, that's fine. It turns out both methods end up giving really similar answers to the estimate for the cost transferred out and the cost left at the end. Anyway, but if you want to use the word more meaningful, that makes more sense. If I'm a manager, I don't really want to be evaluated based on controlling costs, where costs this period are estimated using last period's costs. So this is the idea, and this is why Fifo is preferred to weighted average. When I do this, I don't mean it's greater, that the costs, the estimated costs are greater. No, I mean it's preferred. Because of this reason right here. Now let's go and calculate the cost per equivalent unit for both of these, for this particular example. So cost per equivalent unit, and I'm just going to write that because I don't want to keep writing the same words. I'm going to give myself some room here. Do this, and then alright, cost per equivalent unit for materials under FIFO. What would be the cost added for materials during the period? If we go up here, what costs were added for materials added during July? Right here, 468,000. Divided by the equivalent units for materials for under FIFO, which was 520,000 equivalent units. So we completed the equivalent of 520,000 units this period in July with respect to materials. And the cost added to complete those units was 468,000. So the cost per equivalent unit is 0.9. 90 cents per unit, per equivalent unit. And so you just repeat this process. For conversion, what were the costs added? It was 357,000 right here, divided by the equivalent units for conversion, which was right here. Equivalent units for conversion under FIFO. So 357,000 divided by 510,000 equivalent units equals, I believe if you do this, it's 0.7. And then the same for weighted average, we gotta do sort of the same process. But here's the formula for weighted average right here. So we take the beginning work in process cost for materials plus the cost added for materials over the equivalent units for materials using weighted average. So the beginning cost for materials right here is 27,000 plus the cost added 468. So 27,000 plus 468,000, and then spread that over the equivalent units that we completed for materials under weighted average, which was 556,000. So and you end up getting, now here you're going to get a decimal, and I'm going to round it to the 4th decimal place. You can see it's pretty close to the FIFO cost per equivalent unit for materials. It's pretty close to 0.9, but it's not the same. Because I'm rounding this decimal, when we do our cost reconciliation later, we won't exactly be able to reconcile the cost. It'll be off by a few dollars due to this rounding. But if you kept this full decimal in your calculator and used it throughout your calculations, you would be able to reconcile the costs exactly. Now, for conversion, there was $13,000 worth of conversion costs sitting there at the beginning, plus the cost added for conversion, 357,000, divided by the equivalent units for conversion using weighted average, which was 528,000. See, right here. There's that, and the costs that were at beginning for conversion, which was, there's the 13,000, and then the 357. And then when you do this, you're going to get a decimal. I'll round to the 4th decimal place. So we have this. For most problems and most students, for most of these types of problems, most students feel that parts 1 and 2 will be the hardest. And then after that, it's pretty easy. Let's go ahead and do the other 2 parts. There is a part where people tend to get hung up on here towards the end. So part 3 was we needed to figure out an estimate for the costs that were transferred out right here, and the costs that are left at the end in work in process right here, using FIFO and then using weighted average. So let's do that. So first for FIFO, the costs in ending WIP for materials, and then for conversion. Now, how many units are left at the end? Well, there's 70,000 units, but these are, for materials, are each partially done, right? They're each 80% done with respect to materials. So that's equivalent to, 56,000 units, each 100% done. Right? Times, what did it cost us to get these units, these 56,000 units 100% done? Well, it cost us 0.9 or 90 cents per unit, per equivalent unit, using this right here. So that's the cost sitting there at the end for materials, and then for conversion, it was the 0.7 times the equivalent units left at the end. So here are the costs sitting there, at the end for materials and for conversion. And then we can get a total. And so this is 50,400, and this is 19,600, and the total is 70,000. We're going to need this. This is our estimate for what's left at the bottom of the cup, so to speak, as of the end of July in terms of costs in the work in process etching department account using FIFO. Now let's get an estimate for what went out of this account. What costs were transferred from the work in process etching account to the work in process wiring account or department using FIFO. And here's where students sometimes mess up. Well, the first cost that were transferred will be the costs in beginning WIP. So materials, costs for materials and costs for conversion that were sitting there already at the beginning. These are the first costs that were transferred out under the FIFO assumption. So we know that there were $27,000 worth of materials costs sitting there at the beginning and $13,000 of conversion. It told us that. So that's $40,000 sitting there at the beginning. These are the first costs to be transferred out. And then we transferred out costs related to completing the beginning WIP. We had to incur some costs. There were some costs already sitting there, but then we had to incur some additional costs to take those units in the beginning inventory that were partially done and complete them. And for materials and for conversion. Now, how many units do we have to complete for materials, for example? Well, there were 60,000 units there. Each one of these is 60% done. So that's equivalent to 36,000 units, each being 100% done, which leaves left 24,000 units that we have to take from 0 to 100%. So 24,000 units we have to complete, or 60,000 times 1 minus 0.6. How much does each of these units cost us to complete? Each of these equivalent units cost us 90 cents per equivalent unit, using our FIFO equivalent unit, cost per equivalent unit figure that we calculated in part 2. And so the cost to complete the beginning inventory, beginning WIP inventory for materials under FIFO is this number here. And then for conversion, it's 0.7 times 60,000 times 1 minus, each of those units was 30% done with respect to conversion. So we get these two numbers here. 21,600 and 29,400. And the sum is 51,000. And then finally, there were many units that we started this period and completed. So cost of units started and completed. And for materials and for conversion. How many units did we start and complete this period? Well, it would be the number of units that we started minus the units that are left at the end, using our formula from before. Each of these units that we started and completed this period, how much did it cost us to complete them? 90 cents with respect to materials. And then for conversion, it was 0.7 times units started and completed. So we get 396,000 here and 308,000 here, and the sum of these two numbers is 704,000. I apologize, I'm over here on the right. Maybe kind of hard to see, but so the total cost transferred out from work in process etching to work in process wiring would be 40,000 plus 51,000 plus 704,000, or 795,000. Now, let's go ahead and do part 4. Let's do the cost reconciliation for FIFO before we do the before we do part 3 for weighted average. Let's do the cost reconciliation for FIFO. I'll just put FIFO cost reconciliation. All right, we got first we have the costs that we need to account for. And those would be the beginning costs and the costs that were added. The beginning WIP costs, there was 27,000 sitting there at the beginning for materials, 13,000 sitting there at the beginning for conversion. So the beginning WIP costs 40,000. Right? They gave us that. This is like the fourth time I've looked at this already, but here we go. Beginning WIP. There it is. And then the costs that were added would be the cost added for materials and the cost added for conversion. 468 and 357. These are the costs that we're trying to account for. So the costs that were added, if you add those two, would be 825,000. Let's move this over a little bit. Whoops. Come on. And so the total costs we're trying to account for are $865,000. And then how do we account for them? Well, costs are accounted for as follows. We have our ending WIP, which we estimated to be using Fifo, our ending WIP right here, 70,000. And then we have our cost transferred to the wiring department. We estimated that, which was right here, 795,000. And if you add these together, indeed you get 865,000. So we can check ourselves and say that we're at least on the right track. All right, now let's go back and do part 3 using weighted average. Whoops. Don't want to append the document, I just want to append the page. There we go. Part 3, weighted average. Weighted average costs in ending WIP. We're going to estimate that. We have cost in ending materials, materials cost in ending WIP and conversion cost in ending WIP. How many units are left at the end under weighted average? Well, then it's the same as under FIFO. There's 70,000. Each one of these is 80% done. So that's equivalent to 56,000 units that are complete. How much did it cost us to get those units complete? What was the cost per equivalent unit for materials under weighted average? It was that 0.8903. And then for conversion, it was 0.7008. Cost per equivalent unit times this many equivalent units. I believe this is right. And so then we have this number is 49,857, and this number is 19,622, and the sum of these numbers is 69,479. This is an estimate, our estimate under weighted average for the total costs that are left in ending WIP. Notice that it's similar to what we estimated under FIFO. Under FIFO, we estimated that there was 70,000 left, right? Or we actually did it right up here, right? So it's a similar number. It's off by $521, $521 difference. Why? Because our cost per equivalent unit figures are a little bit different. And then finally, here's our estimate under weighted average for the costs that were transferred out from etching to the wiring process. Um, we don't have to transfer the beginning WIP costs out. And the reason is based on the assumption of weighted average. We assume that each of the units sitting there at the beginning is 0% done. And if each unit is sitting there 0% done, then we're also assuming that there's 0% cost, there's zero cost there at the beginning. We haven't incurred any cost to get those units that are sitting there done. So there, even though we know there's $40,000 worth of beginning inventory costs sitting there, $27,000 for materials and $13,000 for conversion respectively. We know there's $40,000 there, but under a weighted average we assume there's nothing there. So we don't have to transfer that. If there's nothing there, that's not transferred out to the wiring process. The only costs we need to transfer out are those costs to complete the beginning WIP, the cost that we have to incur to take those units that are all sitting there, each 0% done, or what we think are 0% done, complete those, and then plus the cost that we need to take, for the units that we started and completed this period. And so for materials, and then for conversion, materials we have how many units do we need to complete? Well, we assume that there's 60,000 sitting there, and each one of them is, we're assuming under weighted average, 0% done with respect to materials. So we need to complete all 60,000 of them. What does it cost us for each of these units? For materials, it costs us 0.8903. So we do this multiplication here, and we get 53,418. And then for conversion, our cost per equivalent unit is this times, again, there's 60,000. Each of them we're assuming is 0% done with respect to conversion, so that means we need to complete all 60,000 of them. And we're going to get 42,048. And the sum of these is 95,466. And then finally the costs of units started and completed. First for materials, then for conversion. How many units do we start and complete? It's the same old number here, 510, the units that we started minus the units that are left at the end. How much does it cost us to complete each one of these units? For materials, 0.8903 per unit. For conversion, 0.7008 per unit. So we do these calculations, and you end up getting 391,732 here, and here you get 308,352. And so the sum of these two numbers is $700,084. And so the total cost transferred out let me put this down here. Total cost transferred out would be the cost to complete the beginning work in process inventory right here, plus the cost for this unit started and completed. So if you add these two together, you're going to get $795,550. And so now we can do for part 4, for weighted average, we can do a weighted average cost reconciliation. And again, it's going to look, I'm just going to copy and paste the one from Fifo and just replace the numbers that will be different. We're still trying to account for the same costs, right? So the first part is the same. Whoops. It's just these numbers are different. Our estimate for the costs transferred out and the cost in the ending work in process inventory are going to be different. So the costs in ending work in process inventory under weighted average, we came up with this 69,479. And under weighted average for the cost transferred out, we came up with this 795,550. And when you add these two numbers together, you will end up getting 865,029, $865,000, $865,029. And you can see that we're slightly off. We're off by $29, but the difference is only because of rounding this 0.8903 number and this 0.7008 number. It's due to rounding the cost per equivalent unit figures for weighted average. If you remember, when we go all the way back up, our cost per equivalent unit for weighted average, this is part 2, right here. Rounding these numbers right here to 4 decimal places. Again, if we keep these two numbers in our calculator to the full decimal place accuracy, and we replace those, correct numbers in every place that we use those, the rounded numbers all down here, like right here, and right here, and right here, and you replace it with the right number right here, and then you will get exactly the same. So this concludes the video on process costing.